Forget pyramids and mummies for a moment. The most shocking secret of ancient Egypt wasn't hidden in some dark tomb. It was carved proudly into their temple walls for everyone to see. For over 3,000 years, the Egyptians built their entire civilization on a view of creation and fertility so bold that it still shocks us today. Their holiest creation story didn't begin with a divine command or a distant explosion in the heavens. It began with an act of pure cosmic self-pleasure. Pharaohs, regarded as living gods on earth, were expected to marry their own sisters to preserve a sacred bloodline. Major festivals weren't hushed ceremonies cloaked in shame, but enormous, public celebrations of life and procreation, led by priests of Min, the ever-aroused fertility god. And here's the most remarkable part. This wasn't some fringe cult practiced in secret. This was mainstream religion, woven into daily Egyptian life for thousands of years. While other civilizations were beginning to shape ideas of modesty and shame, the Egyptians were holding grand festivals of fertility and openly celebrating the power of life itself. They didn't even have a word for virginity. Women enjoyed freedoms that the world wouldn't see again for millennia. They understood anatomy and birth control better than European doctors would until the 1800s. So buckle in, because this is how one of the greatest civilizations in human history put life creation at the very center of their world, and why we may have misunderstood their wisdom. Forget Adam and Eve. Forget the Big Bang. The Egyptians believed the universe began with divine self-generation, and this wasn't some obscure story whispered by fringe priests. This was the official narrative of creation, taught in temples, carved into stone, and celebrated in public festivals. The god Atum floated alone in the endless waters of chaos, without companion. So what did he do? He created through his own divine power, literally bringing forth existence from himself. From that single shocking act came the first gods, the first humans, and eventually an entire civilization that made creation the cornerstone of their faith. But here's the extraordinary part. They didn't see this as crude or shameful. To them, it was the most sacred act in the universe, the original spark of all existence. Ancient hieroglyphic texts like the Heliopolitan creation myth, dating back to 2400 BCE, describe Atum as he who created himself, who brought himself into being, who generated Shu and Tefnut from himself. Shu became the god of air, Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. And from that first divine moment, the world was born. This wasn't metaphor. The Egyptian language had specific words for self-generation, and they appear in these religious texts. Later writings, like the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, go even further, explicitly describing how Atum took creation into his own hand and performed the first act that sparked the universe into being. What's truly remarkable is how this became sacred for women as well. The title God's Hand became one of the highest honors a woman could hold in ancient Egypt. Queens and priestesses proudly bore it, symbolizing their role as the living embodiment of divine creation. Queen Hatshepsut herself, one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history, claimed the title and had it carved into her temple, and this wasn't hidden in dusty scrolls. These creation scenes were carved into temple walls across Egypt. At Karnak, visited by millions even today, reliefs depict Atum in the very act of divine self-creation. At Dendera, an entire chapel is dedicated to the first time, the sacred moment when everything began. The Egyptians didn't hide it. They celebrated it openly, ensuring every worshipper understood how their universe came into being. This story shaped everything. If the supreme God himself created existence through self-generation, then human creativity and fertility weren't sinful. They were divine. The annual flooding of the Nile, on which Egyptian life depended, was understood as a continuation of that same sacred act, the life-giving waters fertilizing the land. Priests even performed rituals reenacting Atum's creation to ensure the Nile would flood on time. The evidence is everywhere. In 2007, a papyrus in the Turin Museum revealed detailed instructions for a priestly ritual where creation was symbolically reenacted while hymns were chanted. Statues in museums today still show priests in positions of reverence to this act of divine origin. Why did the Egyptians embrace such a radical creation story? Because they recognized a truth that still resonates. Life comes from life. Bodies generate new bodies. Waters bring crops. Creation flows directly from the forces of nature. In a desert civilization utterly dependent on the Nile, the link between generation and survival made perfect sense. Unlike the violent creation myths of Mesopotamia or the word-based creation story of the Hebrews, the Egyptians went straight to biology. Their supreme god didn't fight a dragon or speak light into being. He created as life itself creates. And from this myth came a society that celebrated fertility, honored women as partners in creation, and saw human desire not as shameful but as sacred. This was the foundation of the most enduring civilization in history. And it all began with the most radical creation story the world has ever known. If you thought Atum's self-creation was surprising, wait until you hear about the god who became the living symbol of fertility itself. His name was Min, and for over 6,000 years he wasn't just worshipped. He was celebrated in festivals that made modern carnivals look tame. Min wasn't a minor figure hidden in the shadows of Egyptian belief. He was one of the most prominent gods in the entire pantheon, a deity of masculine power, abundance, and regeneration. Every statue, every carving of him left no doubt about what he represented. His image was always unmistakable, proudly displayed, for all to see. Priests painted his body black to symbolize the fertile soil of the Nile Valley, the ground that gave life to Egypt year after year. And when it came time to honor him, the Egyptians didn't hold back. Imagine an enormous procession winding through the streets. At the center, towering statues of Min carried high on platforms. Walking alongside, priests held up piles of lettuce, not for eating, but because when cut, the plant released a white sap that reminded them of life's generative essence. Lettuce became Min's sacred symbol, a reminder of fertility itself. The pharaoh himself often led these processions, proving that even kings bowed to the god of fertility. Women lined the streets performing ritual gestures, sometimes dancing, sometimes raising their arms in honor, praying for children, health, and abundance. These weren't private whispers in the shadows. They were public rituals, proudly performed for all of Egypt to see. Foreign visitors were stunned. The Greek historian Herodotus, who saw these celebrations in 450 BCE, admitted he could barely bring himself to describe them, even though he had no doubt about what he witnessed. Roman writers were equally shocked. Plutarch noted that women openly venerated Min in ways that would make even Jupiter blush. To outsiders, it seemed scandalous. To Egyptians, it was sacred duty. Archaeology confirms these ancient accounts. In 1998, researchers excavating near the Luxor temple discovered a hidden chamber filled with dozens of small figurines of Min, each showing signs of ritual use. Chemical analysis revealed traces of ancient oils and offerings. These weren't art pieces. They were tools of worship, used for centuries to honor the god of fertility. And it didn't stop at temples. Min's presence filled Egyptian homes. Families kept small shrines to him in their private quarters. Amulets bearing his image were worn as jewelry. Children wore charms of Min for protection. Imagine giving your child a fertility symbol to wear around their neck. That was how normal and natural it was in Egyptian society. The Cairo Museum today has over 10,000 of these amulets, proof that Min's influence reached every corner of daily life. The scale of his worship is staggering. In 2019, archaeologists uncovered a massive brewery near Abydos. Every storage jar was marked with Min's symbols. Tests showed that the beer brewed there was enhanced with herbs believed to increase vitality. And this wasn't small-scale production. The brewery could churn out more than 22,000 liters at a time, enough to supply an entire city during a fertility festival. Imagine thousands of Egyptians feasting, drinking, and celebrating life in Min's honor. Even Egyptian architecture carried his mark. Columns rose as symbols of virility. Doorways were designed as passages of life. And the towering obelisks, those monuments still standing in cities around the world, echoed the same regenerative force Min embodied. The festivals weren't just religious entertainment. They had practical, measurable effects. Temple records reveal that birth rates consistently spiked 9 months after major celebrations. For Egyptians, the gods delivered on their promises in the most human way possible. To modern eyes, it may seem provocative, even scandalous. But to the Egyptians, Min was not just a god of fertility. He was life itself, the creative power that kept the Nile fertile, the crops growing, the people thriving. His festivals were not excess. They were essential, joyful affirmations that the cycle of creation was sacred, and that without it, civilization itself could not survive. If public fertility festivals seemed extreme, what happened inside the royal palaces was even more astonishing. Because for the pharaohs of Egypt, marriage wasn't about romance, politics, or alliances. It was about preserving divine bloodlines, and to do that, they married their own sisters, and sometimes even their daughters. This wasn't scandal. It wasn't whispered about in shame. It was official royal policy, openly carved into temple walls and celebrated as part of divine kingship. For more than 3,000 years, pharaohs weren't just rulers, they were living gods, and gods in Egyptian mythology married their siblings. So pharaohs followed the same example. Take Tutankhamun. When scientists finally examined his remains in 2010, they were stunned. His parents weren't just related. They were full siblings, children of the same mother and father. Tutankhamun himself suffered from severe health problems, scoliosis, a club foot, and other genetic defects. He needed a cane to walk at just 19 years old. These conditions were the biological cost of centuries of sibling marriages, and Tut wasn't an exception. Amenhotep III married his daughter Setamun. His son Akhenaten took several of his daughters as wives. One of them later married Tutankhamun, making her both his sister and his wife. The title King's Sister, King's Wife wasn't symbolic. It was carved proudly onto monuments and tombs. A stele from Amenhotep II's reign even records, "His Majesty's heart was filled with love for his sister, and he made her his great royal wife." Imagine a modern ruler declaring such a thing publicly. It would cause global scandal, but in Egypt it was proof of divinity. The practice continued for centuries. Cleopatra VII, the most famous queen of all, married 2 of her brothers. She wasn't breaking tradition. She was keeping it alive. For 300 years straight, the Ptolemaic dynasty practiced sibling marriage without interruption. By the end, their family tree had folded in on itself. Studies of their remains reveal progressive health problems, infertility, and shortened lifespans, but they accepted the risks. To them, maintaining a pure divine bloodline was worth any cost. The religious justification was clear. The most beloved myth in Egyptian culture was the story of Isis and Osiris, sister and brother who loved each other so deeply that even death couldn't keep them apart. Isis gathered the scattered body of Osiris, restored him, and conceived their son Horus. That myth wasn't just a story. It was a model for royal life. Archaeological evidence shows just how normalized it was. Marriage contracts between royal siblings survive, written in the same legal language as any other union. A papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes dowries and property exchanges between brother and sister without the slightest hint of taboo. Temple reliefs depict sibling couples embracing, their titles carved beside them for all to see. Foreign rulers were baffled. Diplomatic letters from the 14th century BCE reveal Babylonian kings objecting to Egyptian proposals. One wrote, "You ask for my daughter while you wed your own blood. This is not done among civilized peoples." Egypt's reply was blunt. "You would not understand. This is a divine matter." The biological consequences were tragic. Tutankhamun's 2 stillborn daughters, mummified and buried with him, both showed severe genetic defects, But the Egyptians didn't see them as failures. They embalmed the infants with the same care given to kings, believing they would be reborn perfect in the afterlife. Sibling marriage also had practical advantages. It kept power and wealth inside the royal house. It eliminated outside claims to the throne. And it prevented foreign influence. If every rival was also a wife or sister, no one could challenge the pharaoh. The strategy was so effective that even elite non-royal families began copying it, though never to the extreme of the kings. For centuries, scholars tried to deny the evidence. Victorian Egyptologists insisted the word sister might mean beloved or queen, not actual sibling. But DNA tests and inscriptions have confirmed what the ancients themselves declared openly. The pharaohs married their sisters and sometimes their daughters, not as a scandal, but as a divine duty. It sounds shocking now, but for Egyptians, it was the most natural way to keep their rulers close to the gods. If royal sibling marriages shocked you, what ordinary Egyptians were doing in their homes might surprise you even more, because while the rest of the ancient world was bound by rigid taboos and punishments, Egyptians lived with a level of sexual freedom and reproductive knowledge that feels strikingly modern. They were among the first people in history to develop a full system of birth control. And their methods? Unusual, but surprisingly effective. Imagine visiting a physician in 1800 BCE and being prescribed a mixture of crocodile dung, honey, and dough to prevent pregnancy. It sounds bizarre, but it wasn't superstition. Crocodile dung is alkaline, creating a hostile environment for conception. Acacia gum, another common ingredient, contains lactic acid, a natural spermicide still used today. Honey acted as both a barrier and an antimicrobial shield. In other words, they knew what they were doing. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, written nearly 4,000 years ago, reads like a health manual. It lists recipes, instructions, and even notes on which methods had been proven and which were still under observation. The Ebers Papyrus from 1550 BCE describes a mixture of honey and sodium carbonate, applied with precise measurements. These weren't folk remedies. They were clinical trials long before modern science existed, and they didn't stop there. Egyptian women understood fertility cycles. The Berlin Papyrus describes tracking menstruation to predict fertile days. They even had pregnancy tests. Women would urinate on bags of wheat and barley. If the seed sprouted, the test predicted pregnancy. And modern experiments show it worked with about 70% accuracy. That's Bronze Age innovation that rivals some modern pharmacy kits. Archaeology backs it up. Excavations at Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders, uncovered contraceptive tools, bronze implements for removing pessaries, jars with chemical residues matching contraceptive recipes, and even examination chairs. If middle-class workers had access to this technology, contraception was not a privilege. It was mainstream. But contraception was only one part of Egypt's openness. Unlike Greece or Rome, Egyptians had no word for virginity. Women weren't property to be transferred pure from father to husband. Marriage contracts show wives keeping their own property, initiating divorce, and even demanding alimony. One contract bluntly reads, "If you take another woman to your bed, I shall leave and take my property." Divorce could happen for any reason, even simple incompatibility. The instructions of Ptah-hotep, a wisdom text, even advised men to ensure their wives' satisfaction in all aspects of marriage. Compare this to other ancient cultures where women were locked away or punished harshly for infidelity. In Egypt, women had rights, independence, and control over their own lives. The Turin erotic papyrus, often misunderstood as scandalous art, was really a kind of instruction manual. It depicted positions and techniques, but alongside them were notes about contraceptive precautions. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't forbidden, it was education for couples. And it survived because Egyptians didn't see intimacy as shameful. They saw it as practical, natural, and worth celebrating. Even professional companionship was regulated and protected. Contracts survived, showing workers suing clients for non-payment and winning. One papyrus records a woman claiming property rights against a man who tried to cheat her. In many ways, their legal protections were stronger than what exists in parts of the modern world. This freedom came from necessity. In a narrow desert valley where survival depended on the Nile, population control wasn't just personal choice. It was social responsibility. Too many mouths to feed during a low flood meant starvation. Contraception kept balance. Temple inscriptions even praised women who knew when to open and when to close their wombs. Family planning wasn't rebellion. It was duty to society and to the gods. So while other civilizations punished women, silenced them, and treated reproduction as mystery, Egypt embraced knowledge, freedom, and responsibility. They turned what we often treat as taboo into something sacred, scientific, and openly celebrated. If Egyptian life on Earth seemed bold and liberated, their vision of the afterlife was even more extraordinary. For most religions, paradise meant peace, harmony, or endless worship. But for the Egyptians, death wasn't the end of joy. It was the beginning of eternal vitality. They believed the afterlife was a place where youth, beauty, and pleasure lasted forever. And they prepared for it with astonishing care. Mummification wasn't only about preserving the body. It was about ensuring that every part of a person could remain vigorous in eternity. When researchers examined mummies in the early 2000s, they found something unexpected: anatomically precise techniques used to preserve vitality itself. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate acts of preparation, ensuring that kings, queens, and even common people could enjoy eternal energy in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. The Book of the Dead makes it crystal clear. Spell 69 promises the deceased shall have power for eternity. Other spells guarantee eternal youth and endless vigor. The afterlife wasn't imagined as a shadowy half-existence. It was envisioned as a world of full enjoyment, where every desire could be fulfilled. The artifacts prove how seriously they took it. Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't just filled with gold and treasures. It held jars of oils and ointments specifically labeled for eternal vitality. Nefertari, the favorite queen of Ramesses II, was buried with items of personal care and beauty. Even the graves of ordinary Egyptians contained fertility amulets, symbolic tools, and texts promising eternal youth. Everyone, regardless of wealth, expected to share in the paradise of vitality. The Turin erotic papyrus, long misunderstood as scandalous art, has recently been retranslated. It wasn't just entertainment. It was an instruction manual for eternity. The positions it depicted weren't possible for ordinary bodies. Hieroglyphic captions explained, "In the field of reeds, the body knows no limits." It was a guidebook for joys reserved for the afterlife. Excavations confirm this vision. In 2018, archaeologists discovered a tomb at Saqqara, where walls were covered in scenes of eternal pleasure. The deceased was shown enjoying companionship with both humans and gods, each scene carefully labeled in hieroglyphics. Preparing such a tomb would have cost years of income, yet even middle-class officials invested in it. That's how central the belief in eternal vitality was to Egyptian culture. Children, too, were prepared. Though their mummies were not given adult treatments, they were buried with fertility amulets and texts promising that once they reached maturity in the afterlife, they would enjoy the same eternal pleasures as adults. In Egypt, even death did not deny anyone the fullness of life. Some texts went further, describing the afterlife as a place beyond earthly restrictions. A papyrus from the Ptolemaic era states, "In the field of reeds, all become as gods, and gods know no forbidden unions." In other words, every joy, every possibility, every union was not just permitted but celebrated. Egyptians believed death was not the end, but the grand transformation into an eternity of vitality. They mummified their bodies, packed their tombs with tools of pleasure, and inscribed their walls with instructions, all so they could step into the next world ready for endless youth, strength, and joy. For them, dying didn't mean silence. It meant joining the gods in a celebration that would never end. For a civilization that openly celebrated fertility, vitality, and even eternal pleasure. You might think nothing was off limits. But the Egyptians did have one strict taboo, and it reveals just how complex and sophisticated their society really was. It revolved around death, and a very specific waiting period that had to be observed before mummification could begin. When a person of high status died, their body wasn't taken to the embalmers right away. Families waited 3 full days before handing over the remains. Not for mourning, not for ceremonies, but for protection. The Egyptians knew that in those first days, before decomposition set in, the body was most vulnerable to violation. To prevent such acts, they created a mandatory waiting period. Greek historian Herodotus wrote about this practice in 440 BCE, barely able to hide his shock. He explained that beautiful women and wives of nobles were never delivered to embalmers until the 3rd or 4th day. Only after natural changes had begun were they considered safe. His account might sound exaggerated, but archaeological evidence and papyrus court records confirm it. One legal document from the 19th dynasty describes an embalmer named Paneb, who was accused of violating a noblewoman's remains before the waiting period had passed. His punishment? The most severe penalty imaginable: premature mummification while still alive. It was a brutal warning to anyone who dared to cross this line. The Egyptians understood their climate. In the intense heat, 3 days was enough for decomposition. To begin, ensuring the body could no longer be misused. Families kept the deceased in ventilated chambers or guarded houses during the waiting period. Wealthy households even hired watchmen to make sure the body was protected until the time had passed. Tomb paintings support this. Scenes of families delivering bodies to embalmers often depict them with visible signs of natural change, making it clear that the taboo was being respected. Royal mummies, however, were an exception. Pharaohs were embalmed immediately under constant supervision and heavy ritual protection. In their case, divine status was thought to keep them safe. The waiting period had spiritual importance too. Egyptians believed that violating a body during this transitional state could trap the soul, preventing it from reaching the afterlife. The Book of the Dead includes spells specifically cursing anyone who would defile the deceased in their house of eternity. Tomb inscriptions threatened eternal annihilation to violators, an unthinkable fate in Egyptian religion. The stigma around embalmers shows how seriously this taboo was taken. Though highly paid, embalmers were socially isolated. They lived in separate quarters outside towns, often marrying only within their own families. Some marriage contracts even specified that no daughter of a respectable household could wed an embalmer. They were both essential and distrusted, guardians of the most sacred and dangerous task in society. Even funerary contracts spelled out the rule. One surviving papyrus states clearly, "Should the embalmer accept the body before natural, change is evident. The agreement is void and punishment shall follow." Families could take embalmers to court for violating this law, even if nothing improper had occurred. The risk alone was enough to condemn them. Over time, the waiting period became a social marker. Only the most privileged, queens, pharaohs, or those with divine authority, could bypass it and be embalmed immediately. Cleopatra herself ordered her body prepared without delay, declaring, "My beauty shall not wait for time." For her, avoiding the waiting period was another symbol of elite power. The 3-day rule might seem grim to us, but to the Egyptians it was essential. It showed respect for the dead, protection for the soul, and recognition of the dangerous liminal space between life and eternity. Even in the most open society of the ancient world, some boundaries were too sacred to cross. Everywhere you look in ancient Egypt, the very stones tell a story. The Egyptians didn't just celebrate creation in rituals and festivals. They carved it into their architecture, embedding the forces of life and regeneration into every monument they built. Walk through an ancient temple, pass between its towering pylons, and you aren't just entering a building, you're stepping into a symbolic rebirth. Take the obelisk. To modern tourists, it's just a massive stone needle. Impressive, but mysterious. To the Egyptians, it was a monument to divine creation itself. The tall shaft symbolized the strength of Ra, the sun god. The golden pyramidion at the top caught the first rays of dawn, representing the spark of life piercing the heavens. Each sunrise was cosmic creation replayed in stone. These weren't vague metaphors. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on obelisks spell. One at Luxor reads, "I stand eternal, the creative power of Atum made stone." Another in Rome, taken from Egypt, declares, "The golden light of Ra flows from my peak at dawn, bringing life to the land of Egypt." Placement mattered too. Obelisks were always erected in pairs at temple entrances, flanking the doorway. Passing between them and stepping through the pylon wasn't just an architectural experience, it was symbolic transformation, leaving behind the old self and entering renewed. The sloping sides of pylons represented the mountains of the horizon, the lintel across the top, the sky itself. Walking through was to follow the sun's daily journey from death to rebirth. Columns carried the same meaning. Their bundled shapes echoed papyrus and lotus plants, symbols of growth and regeneration. Enter the hypostyle hall at Karnak, with its forest of 134 massive columns, and you're standing in a symbolic swamp of creation, the primeval marsh from which life first emerged. The ceilings painted blue with golden stars weren't decoration. They were the night sky brought down into the sacred space. Even pyramids carried this language. Their shape recalled the primordial mound rising from the waters of chaos, the very first land created by divine power. The internal passages ascended toward the heavens, guiding the soul on its journey of transformation. The burial chamber deep within acted as a symbolic womb, where the dead were reborn into eternal life. The Egyptians even engineered sound into their sacred spaces. Recent acoustic studies show temple chambers were designed to amplify and echo human voices, turning ritual chants into booming waves of resonance. Priests singing hymns to the gods would hear their voices magnified as though the temple itself were alive, vibrating with divine vitality. Water played its role as well. Sacred lakes built beside temples represented the primordial waters of creation. Priests bathed in them before rituals, symbolically returning to the beginning of time. Some temples were aligned so that the annual Nile flood would flow directly into their courtyards, physically bringing the gods' blessing of fertility to the holy sanctuary. And this influence didn't stay in Egypt. When Rome, Paris, London, and New York erected Egyptian obelisks in their squares, they carried symbols of creation with them, though most tourists today have no idea what they represent. Even the Washington Monument is modeled after these sacred forms, a towering echo of Egypt's celebration of regenerative power. The Egyptians built their beliefs into the very foundations of their world. Every temple, every column, every obelisk wasn't just architecture. It was a living symbol of creation and rebirth, designed to remind every passerby that life, vitality, and regeneration were the forces holding the universe together. So what does all of this mean for us today? We've journeyed through a civilization that dared to celebrate creation and vitality in ways most of us can barely imagine. For over 3,000 years, the Egyptians lived by a worldview that treated fertility, pleasure, and regeneration not as shameful secrets, but as the very forces that kept the universe alive. Think about what we've uncovered. Their supreme God Atum created the world through divine self-generation, and they carved that truth onto temple walls for everyone to see. Their fertility god Min was paraded through the streets in festivals that made even Greek and Roman visitors blush. Pharaohs married their sisters and daughters as a divine duty, ensuring bloodlines stayed close to the gods. Everyday women used advanced contraception, had legal rights to divorce, and enjoyed freedoms that disappeared for millennia afterward. The dead were prepared not just for eternal rest, but for eternal vitality, armed with ointments, amulets, and even illustrated manuals for pleasure in the afterlife. Their monuments, pyramids, columns, obelisks, were built as giant stone symbols of regeneration, still standing thousands of years later in cities across the world. And through it all, they lasted. While empires rose and fell, Egypt endured, for longer than any other great civilization. They proved that openness didn't mean weakness, that a culture could embrace life fully, honor women, celebrate fertility, and still build wonders that continue to inspire awe. Contrast that with, today, we hide discussions of creation behind euphemisms, whisper about intimacy, and build taboos around what they carved in stone. We debate contraception in courts while they were prescribing it in papyri 4,000 years ago. We marvel at obelisks in Rome, Paris, and New York without realizing we're staring at monuments to divine creation. The Egyptians remind us that our modern restrictions aren't inevitable. They're choices, and maybe, just maybe, they've blinded us to truths that one of the most successful civilizations in history understood all along, that life, creation, and regeneration are the forces that hold everything together. So next time you see an obelisk in a city square or walk through the stone gates of a museum, remember what they really mean. They're not just relics of a distant past. They're messages carved in stone, whispering across millennia. Life is sacred. Creation is divine. And vitality is the foundation of civilization itself.